Welcome. My name is Elaine Ikoma Ko, and I'm a contributing writer to the Japanese American newspaper called the North American Post, based in Seattle. And this newspaper is also the sister newspaper for the Japanese language newspaper called Soy Source. And my grandpa was the publisher of this newspaper right after they were released from the incarceration camps after World War II. So, there's a really close connection with the newspaper. So today, we are with James Kenji Lopez Alt, and this taped interview on, like I say, a gorgeous summer day in Seattle, where now he lives, will be a companion video. We will have the interview published in our newspapers, and it'll also be available for people to view online, which you are viewing right now. My professional videographer, I need to mention, is my daughter-in-law, Crystal Brown. You can't see her, but she's here. So by way of introduction, Kenji, Japanese-American chef and food writer expert, is arguably the world's most famous celebrity food influencer. He was born in Boston and now living in Seattle. This is how I describe him, but others have too. Kenji's rise to fame has its own story, and today his social media presence is second to none. His YouTube channel has more followers than the New York Times cooking channel at 1.2 million followers, and his Instagram has nearly 500,000 followers. So anyone who has followed Kenji, who's really interested in the scientific reasons and backgrounds and how to make your cooking more effective and better, they probably know who Kenji is. So today we're going to dive right in. I do want to mention that Kenji has 3 published books. The first one was The Food Lab, Better Home Cooking Through Science, and it was a New York Times bestseller, James Beard Award winner, and probably a bunch of other awards as well. His next book was published in 2020, Every Night is Pizza Night. It explores the idea of what counts as the best food. And the main character thinks that pizza is the greatest food ever, but then she meets other children from different cultural backgrounds who tell her that their favorite foods are actually the best. That sounds like a great book. And his latest book, just published recently, is The Wok. And here is the book. And this is all my little notes here of different recipes that I have yet to cook all of them and follow all of them. To me, this book is the final book that I will ever need in my kitchen. And it's that good. Okay, so let's dive right in and learn more from Kenji about his story. So welcome, Kenji.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with sharing a little bit about your parents.
Mm-hmm.
Your mother's from Japan, your father is a geneticist or I guess immunologist.
Mm-hmm.
How did they meet? A little bit more about your parents.
Yeah, so my mother is Japanese, so she was born in Nagoya and grew up in Nagoya and Tokyo. And she came to the U.S. When she was a teenager, like as a late teenager, to finish junior college and then college. And so she moved to California.
By herself?
By herself, yeah. And so she went to school at the Mill School of Design as a designer. And meanwhile, my dad is originally from Western Pennsylvania, so he grew up his father was a steel worker, so he grew up in rural Western Pennsylvania, and they met when he was in graduate school at Stanford. So he went into science and was in graduate school at Stanford, and I think they were both kind of hippies, and they'll deny this, but I've seen the photos. So I think
wasn't back then.
So they met in California, and then were married in 1974, and had my sister out in California, and then my dad got a job as a geneticist at Columbia University. I'm sorry, first at MIT. Actually, I might be totally wrong about this. I should know my own family background, but they moved to Boston, which is where I was born, and then to New York, where my other sister was born, and Yeah, so that, I mean, that's my background. My mother, and my grandparents on my mother's side, from Japan. My grandfather's also a scientist, but they moved to the U.S. Shortly after my parents were married. And when we were living in New York, I grew up in New York basically from the time I was 4 years old till 18. But when we were living in New York, we lived in an apartment building. We were in apartment 10J. My grandparents were in apartment 9J. So I grew up very close to my Japanese grandparents, and my grandmother didn't speak English, so Japanese was kind of the main.
So when did they come over? Your Japanese grandparents?
They came over shortly after my parents were married, so in the late 70s.
Late 70s.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So they actually lived in Boston for a little while as well, and then my grandfather was a organic chemist. In fact, the first Japanese organic chemist working in the U.S. at Columbia University
What brought
since
them?
the 70s. I think my grandfather's work in chemistry.
Okay. And then, so your Japanese grandparents came here quite a while ago. They lived here in the U.S. for their rest of their
In New
life?
York, yeah. My grandmother passed away in 2007, and my grandfather just passed away 2 years ago.
Oh, wow.
But they lived in New York up until then.
Okay, and so they never really wanted to go back to Japan?
They spent a lot of time, of course, visiting, and most of in fact, all of my grandparents' side, both of their families are still in Japan. But no, my grandfather, I think he got his job at Columbia, and he loved work more than anything. And so, essentially up until he physically was not able to go to work, he was going to work every day in chemistry.
And so today, what about your parents today? Are they still alive?
Yeah, so my father is still a geneticist. He's now at Harvard. He runs a lab at the Children's Hospital, genetics research, and my mother still lives in New York. And yeah, they're both alive and well.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thanks for sharing a little bit about your family history. And I'm going to come back to talking a little bit about
Sure.
that in a little bit. But let's so you go by Kenji.
Yes.
Not your first birth name, which is James. Was that just a personal preference? Or
Since I was a little kid, since before I can even remember, but I know just from what my parents tell me that I was named James. I always went by nicknames when I was a kid, but I told my parents that I wanted people to call me Kenji, as opposed to James from before I could remember. So ever since I was a little kid, I went by Kenji, or my nickname was Kobuki, which is also something that I asked my parents to call me. I just started calling myself that. And Kobuki, yeah.
Okay.
That was my nickname up until I was like 12 years old, 13 years old.
Okay. And like today, do you you go by Kenji?
Yeah.
You don't. What about the title Chef Kenji? Is that not?
No. First of all, I'm not officially a chef anymore because I no longer have a restaurant. But even when I had a restaurant, I'm not much of a titles person, so
Okay.
I just ask people to call me Kenji.
Yeah.
If they call me chef, then
Yeah.
I won't correct them unless it's in like a sort of long-term working relationship. In which case, I'll say, hey, just call me Kenji.
Okay. Well, it's kind of like Oprah. You don't need a last name.
Right.
Everybody knows Kenji. Okay. All right. So, how did you first fall into cooking? I mean, there's a long history with your home. I guess there was a lot of Chinese cooking from your father, and then your mother being Japanese.
Yeah.
How did that all
I
go?
wasn't particularly interested in cooking as a kid. I liked watching cooking shows. So I watched a lot of PBS, and I watched a lot of cooking shows on PBS, so like Julia Child and Jacques Pepin and The Galloping Gourmet and Great Chefs on PBS. Those types of shows. But I also watched like Bob Ross, and I liked all those sort of educational PBS shows, whether they were cooking or painting or anything else. But yes, my father, who again is from Western Pennsylvania, was super into Chinese food, and so living in between Boston and New York, both of which have very robust Chinatowns and Chinese populations. We spent a lot of time going to all the restaurants in Chinatown and sort of getting familiar with both with Chinese American cuisine, but also in New York at the time it was mainly sort of Cantonese and Hong Kong style Chinese cooking that was going on in New York. But over the year, and in Boston there was a lot more sort of Sichuan food. But over the years, I think both cities have developed more regional Chinese cuisines. So we spent a lot of time trying to familiarize ourselves with those foods. And they were always, Chinese food was always my favorite food growing up, other than Japanese food, I would say. And my mom, you know, having grown up in Japan, cooked a lot of Japanese home cooking. So, you know, both traditional Japanese dishes, but a lot more of the food she cooked was more the yoshoku style, so like Western Japanese food. So things like hamburg steak and curry rice and things like that. So things that any Japanese kid would know. So we ate a lot of that growing up. But my mom, you know, also, I think she felt this urge to learn a lot more American stuff as well. So she also cooked a lot of like New York Times recipes and Betty Crocker stuff, you know. So we had.
She was a cook. I mean, she did a lot of the cooking.
She did all the cooking. So my dad would cook on special, like sometimes on weekends, special occasions. My mom was the day-to-day cook, and my mom does not like cook. I mean, she'll be the first to tell you that she does not like cooking, but you know, both out of frugality and also I think, you know, the need to have a family meal. You know, it was always, everybody was always at the dinner, like me and my sisters, my mom, every night, every meal we had together.
And how many siblings?
I have two sisters.
Two sisters. Did you follow her cooking at that early stage? And were you in the kitchen a lot? I mean,
not really. I would, you know, I enjoyed cooking with my dad on those sort of like special, because those are the times when like my dad would like pull out the books and we were like, all right, we're going to be making, we would pick what we're going to make, and we'd go out and get we'd go to Chinatown, we'd get the ingredients. And so those are like the sort of like special trip cooking thing, like that, where we'd make a day out of cooking, which as a homemaker, you can't do that, right? You have all this other stuff you have to do.
Sure.
And so my mom was much more the practical cook.
The meals.
Like, let's get the meals done. Let's get everybody around the table. Whereas my dad was like, today's activity is going to be making hot and sour soup. Right? And so I as a kid, I enjoyed that a lot more, of course. And today, I mean, I'm the opposite. It's like I have two kids of my own. I make all the meals for the house. It's like, get it done. And sometimes I do the elaborate stuff when I can get my daughter involved or the family involved. But I was never really into cooking. I kind of fell into cooking accidentally, because it was a, you know, I went to school as a biology major, and then after I had been doing, so I'd spent a couple summers in high school and then in college working in biology labs in the summers. And after my third summer doing that, I sort of realized like I don't actually enjoy lab work very much. And if I continue as a biology major, I'm going to be doing this lab work for the foreseeable future, you know, for decades. And so I saw myself going down this path that I didn't want to go down. And so after my sophomore year of college, that summer I decided to kind of just take the summer off, not work in a lab, not do any sort of school work, and just relax for the summer and figure out what I was going to do. So I needed to get a summer job, essentially. And so I was trying to get a job as a waiter at a bunch of local Boston restaurants. And it just happened to go into one restaurant where they said they had a cook who didn't show up that day. And so if I could start working immediately, I could have a job as a cook for the summer. So I was like, okay, sure. Like,
wow,
it'll pay the bills.
That's how you fell into it.
And that's how I fell into it. And I ended up, you know, as soon as I got into that kitchen, I was like, oh, this is great. You know, I loved it. I love like the, I mean, I love the physical work of cooking. I love sort of in restaurant, you know, in restaurant cooking is different from home cooking. But at the time, I really enjoyed sort of like the adrenaline of getting food out fast and repeating that process and making sure that it's up to a certain level of quality, and you know, and I liked planning and seeing like, all right, I have like these 20 different tickets with orders on them. How am I going to cook them efficiently? And so, you know, so in that sense, it was kind of, cooking in a restaurant is a different kind of challenge than cooking at home or recipe development, which as a you know, a 19-year-old, I loved.
Wow, that's interesting.
I don't think I can handle working in. I mean, I had my own restaurant up until a couple of years ago, but at 40 years old, it's a little different than at 19 years old.
Wow, you really
and not
have
something
come
you
full
can.
circle, though.
Yeah. But I fell in love with also the act of cooking, and that was when I was like, this is going to be my career. So, you know, I finished it with school with a degree in architecture. I spent about 6 months working in an architecture firm, kind of just to make sure that cooking was, you know, I was like, I should give it a fair shot, at least for my mom's sake, because my mom doesn't want to be the mother to a cook. So I gave architecture a shot, and you know, the whole time was just like, I should be back in the kitchen.
You really felt that.
Yeah.
The passion. There's a whole long career that followed after this, and our readers and our viewers can either they know already or they don't. But what was interesting, and one of the questions I had to do with the scientific part of cooking, which I think you really have done so masterfully. Was that part of your biology and your science background and your parents and grandparents having that kind of technical scientific background and then bring that to food? I mean, how did that all happen?
So, growing up, as I said, my mom's parents lived with us. So we lived one floor apart. And so, my dad being a geneticist and my grandfather being a chemist, like whenever we had family dinners where both of them were there, then the conversation would just be all science. And so just sort of like the language of science and the process of science was something that me and my sisters both kind of grew up with, and it was always my favorite subject in school and all that. And so I, as a kid, I had what my mom would call an annoying curiosity about things. It's the same way with my daughter now. Like everything is like, but why? What do you mean? Why? What do you mean when you say that? Why does that? Yeah. And so, I was the kind of kid who wanted to like take the screws off the VCR and open it up and see how it works. And so, when I went into cooking in restaurants, I loved every aspect of it. The one part that I didn't always enjoy was that cooking in a restaurant, your goals are sort of consistency and efficiency. And so there's not much time to sit down and say, well, why are we doing it this way? Well, we're doing it this way because that's the way the chef learned to do it, or that's the way the chef taught you to do it, and you have to do it the same way every time because the customer wants the same thing every time, right? And so you can't sit there and say, okay, well, I'm gonna cook this potato 5 different ways and see if I can, and see what happens. You don't have a lot of time to tinker in a restaurant kitchen, and especially back then. I think maybe these days there are some restaurants that have like dedicated cooking labs and staff that's there whose only job is to tinker, right? So I think that's great, but at the time, and especially at the kinds of places I was working at, you couldn't do that. And so as I was working, in the years that I was working in restaurants, I had this kind of growing list of questions, like why do we make the pasta this way? Why do we boil the potatoes like that? Why do we sear this meat like that? All these questions that I kind of wanted to answer for myself, but I never had the time to do it. And so eventually, when I transitioned over to writing about food, it was because a friend of mine saw that Cooks Illustrated, a magazine that is based out of Brookline. I was living in Boston at the time. Right. A friend of mine saw that Cooks Illustrated was hiring test cooks. This is back when job advertisements were in newspapers and you had to circle them. So he showed me the newspaper. Look, they're hiring test cooks. You should apply for this job. That sounds like something you would enjoy. And I was actually unfamiliar with the magazine at that point. But I got a bunch of issues and I read it. It's like, oh, like they do testing here. Like you can get a job doing this kind of thing that I've wanted to do. And so I applied for the job, and it was a very rigorous application process, the most rigorous application process. Months long. You had to go in and you had to do sample recipes. You had to go in and cook. So it wasn't just a regular job interview. But
you found you loved it.
Oh yeah, I loved it. I mean, I got that job and it was great. It was like
that was your passion.
Yeah, I get paid to not just cook, but also to this list of questions I have, like all these things that I wanted to answer. I can take them to my editor and say, hey, I want to answer this question, and they'd be like, yeah, go do it. Which I thought, was wonderful.
So that's sort of from there, just kind of kept evolving, because the food lab is really all about that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
From there, from that's where I sort of, the other side of this whole equation is the writing, right, and the communication.
Right.
And I had never considered myself a writer or a communicator before I started working at Cooks Illustrated, but I found that was actually something that I also really enjoyed, writing. And so, while I was working at Cooks Illustrated, I wanted to get better at writing, and so I took a bunch of gigs writing for weekly newspaper, the free weekly newspapers in Boston. I think there was one called the Weekly Dig, there was the Boston Phoenix, and I would write little short food columns, reviews, and restaurant reviews. I would write online, and so basically, I spent as much time, all the time that I wasn't cooking and testing, I would spend writing because I wanted to get better at writing. Which Did
you have a vision at that time that you would be doing more writing?
No, yeah, I never really have a future vision. It's always just like, what do I want to learn how to do now? And so whatever
Mhm.
piques my interest. I've always found that since I was a kid, you know, it's very difficult for me to put a lot of work into something that I don't enjoy. So if I find the thing I enjoy, it makes sense for me to just like concentrate my effort there because I enjoy doing it.
Mhm.
And if I enjoy doing it, I'm going to put a lot of work into it. And if I put a lot of work into it, I'm going to get better at it.
That's a great message for young people because a lot of people don't figure that out till later in life. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I was lucky to be able to figure that out. I mean, of course, I was also lucky to have to be in a position where I could take risks. Like I could risk becoming a cook, which is not something that everybody can do, or take risks writing free articles for newspapers because I wanted to,
Yeah.
and not everybody has the time or ability. Has the time or
Right.
the safety net to be able to do that kind of stuff. So so I understand. I'm very lucky in that regard. I practiced writing, and then eventually when I got married and we moved to New York for my wife's job, and so I was editing. When we moved to New York, Cooks Illustrated, they don't really have full-time staff that isn't at the office, and so I was editing for them freelance and doing some freelance science consulting, food science consulting for them. But eventually I started writing for a site called Serious Eats. I wrote a couple articles for them, and then Ed Levine, the founder of Serious Eats, took me out to lunch one day, and he's like, what do you like writing about? And I was like, well, I've always wanted to do like a food science column, a column that's just about recipes and science. He's like, all right, like, do it. Like, you can have the first, like, we'll publish your first one next week. Write as much as you want. We'll pay you $30 an article, which is, nothing. And it turned out the first article I published was like 3,000 words about boiled eggs. So, $30 an article is whatever, a penny a word, I think. Yeah. So not quite the going rate for food writing at the time, but that was the going rate for food blogs, because like online writing, it was like the Wild West. It was at its infancy then. But I mean, I had never had more fun than that because at Cooks Illustrated, I loved the fact that I could, have a job testing recipes and testing food science and writing recipes. The one thing that I didn't love about it was the intense editorial process because Cooks Illustrated, well, first of all, writing for a magazine and as you know, writing for newspapers, you have column space and you can't exceed it, so you have word counts and you have to stick to them. And so there is a craft in that, right, where it's like, how do I choose the right words? How do I make this sentence more efficient? How do I get the same message across in less space? Yeah, and that's fun. But Cooks Illustrated also has this sort of style, like a house style, and I always describe it as a sausage where whatever, every people write their words and people write their stories, and then it goes through this whole Cooks Illustrated
machine.
sausage grinder, and it comes out at the end as Cooks Illustrated sausage. And so you're whatever character you had, some of it might leak through into there, but it's still a Cooks Illustrated story. Whereas writing online, you do whatever you want. I found the same freedom that I found as far as like being able to test recipes and test food science, I found in being able to develop my writing voice. And I think there's no better way to develop a writing voice than just writing all the time.
And so that kind of was the genesis eventually for the Food Lab book,
exactly.
Which was just really, I mean, it was just incredibly thick with, all these scientific, technical things about cooking and food. It was just, it's great.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, like writing the book, that was a 5-year-long process.
Wow.
But writing the column on Serious Eats, the Food Lab column, and writing the book, for me, it was always the way I imagine, the voice that I sort of ended up developing was what I do is I imagine that I just learned something really cool, which is usually the case. I usually, like, when I'm testing a recipe, I do learn something really cool, whether it's like from a scientific research or from my own testing or whatever, is that I just learned something really cool and I really want to tell someone about it. And so I imagined I'm just sitting there with another friend in the kitchen saying, hey, like, look at this really interesting thing that I just learned. And I find that, when I think about it that way, then the excitement comes through, and a subject like science that can be dry, when you can show people how science can apply to their macaroni and cheese, then suddenly the science is exciting to them, right?
So So following up on that, what do you consider your well, I don't know if it's your greatest passion, but maybe some of your greatest cooking ideas that you came across, discoveries. There's so many, so maybe that's not a fair question. You know, I know there was the reverse seared steak was something that you kind of popularized. You weren't the first, but you were nearly the first. But that was a popular one. But
I mean, you know, all those things that, there's like specific recipes. You know, I think my most popular recipes have probably been like, I have this like no knead, no stretch pizza where you basically just make a really loose dough and let it spread itself out into a cast iron pan and bake it. And that's the recipe I think that I see posted most often. Reverse searing steak, that's something that's just now is a thing that people do. Although again, there were other people who were doing it before I did it.
But you were the first one really to popularize it.
Yeah, well, you know, it was not a very well-known technique, and you know, when I wrote about it at Cooks Illustrated, we didn't know that anybody else was doing it. It was only kind of later on that someone was like, "Oh, hey, this guy was doing it here." I think Heston Blumenthal had done something similar in one of his other books, something like that. But certainly like before the mid 2000s, it wasn't really a known technique, and now everybody just does it, or at least everybody knows about it. But you know, I think really the stuff I'm more proud about, rather than specific techniques or recipes, I think just getting people more engaged in thinking about food in this way, you know, because there's many ways you can think about food, and I don't think there's one way that's better or worse than another, but it's like I didn't grow up really with family recipes. You know, like I said, like I learned, you know, Chinese food and Mexican food from my dad, who was in turn learning it from books or from visiting restaurants and talking to chefs. I learned some Japanese home cooking from my mom, but my mom was also cooking a lot of sort of American stuff that she was just learning. And so it's not like, you know, some people will say like, all right, I grew up in an Iranian household and I learned how to cook this dish from my grandmother, who learned it from her grandmother. Yeah. And there's this sort of idea that like this food is closely tied to my identity. And I don't feel that particular way about a lot of dishes. Like there's no particular food that I very closely tie with my identity. And also, you know, I think there was also this entire generation of people, probably around my age now, maybe in their 40s now, who grew up with two working parents, right? And so they didn't have this culture of cooking at home, or having the one parent who cooked their family recipes at home. And so they might have had takeout a lot, or they might have had someone who followed, like my mom did, followed recipes from various books a lot. And so when you grow up in that sort of way, you don't learn a specific way to cook. And so there were a lot of people, I think, when I was in my 20s and writing about this stuff, who were also in their 20s, going out into the world on their own. Maybe they'd just come out of college, they were trying to learn how to cook, and they didn't have these family recipes or these techniques that they knew to fall back on. So people who have this sort of mindset of trying to understand sort of the technique and science of something, it was a way for them to get into cooking without having had these family traditions. And of course, you know, there is stuff that applies to traditional foods as well. But I think it was, for a lot of people, like their entry point into cooking, because it talked about cooking in a way that was different from what they were used to.
And so, like, the three books that were very different, similar, you know, the Food Lab, and then The Wok has a lot of the science behind. I mean, there's so much science in this as well. And you talk about, because this is very accessible. I mean, very few of us are scientifically minded, but the book is very accessible. I mean, you can really follow, and it's just so simply broke down. I haven't really had a chance to really dig into the Food Lab. And then there was the pizza book, and that sounded like it was fun. The children's book, and that just sounded like fun. Was that also part of, you know, just your interests and your passions and sharing what you've learned? And they're all different. They're all different books.
The children's book was really, I mean, it was a passion project, but mainly it was like I had a daughter, and I wanted to write a book for her, and I wanted to do it well, you know, and so writing the children's book was actually a much bigger challenge for me than writing either of the food books, because it was a completely different medium than what I'm used to. And so I had to develop a whole new different voice. So, you know, and writing a children's book, I thought, oh, it's it's easy. It's writing a children's book, but it's not, because
Right.
you have to, in the same sense that, like, writing is a lot about editing and picking the right words and and really crafting your sentences right, to get your messages across in a clear and efficient way. Like a children's book is kind of that taken to the extreme, because a children's book has to have a story and it has to have a message. And a theme, but you have to do it in a couple hundred words instead of a couple thousand words, or
And
so
did that book pique interest in kids, to both from a cultural understanding of differences, but also in cooking? Do you think?
I mean, I can only go based on what people have told me, but it was a bestseller, and people have responded that their kids ask them to read it all the time, and that they've now, their kid has now asked for like bibimbap for dinner, which is like one of the dishes that the girl eats. So the concept of the theme behind the pizza book is actually about what the idea of best and what best means, and the idea was sort of fed by the fact that my first book, The Food Lab. A lot of foods I sort of describe in it as best, and what I generally meant when I said best was like, I'm going to take this recipe, I'm going to test every single thing about it. So if I write about chocolate chip cookies, I'm going to test like what different types of sugar do to the cookie, what creaming the butter does to the cookie, what melting the butter does to the cookie. I'm going to test every sort of variable I can think of, because that way, if you see how all these different things affect the final cookie, you can choose to follow my recipe, but you can also now have, armed with that information, you can now modify the recipe to suit your own taste. So if you like it a little chewier, you can use more brown sugar instead of white sugar. If you like it a little crisper, you can use white sugar. So things like that. And so that's really what I meant by best, was that you can make it your own. But what ended up happening, I found, was that a lot of times people would take this idea of best and use it to kind of put other people's foods down. So if somebody online posted a picture of a meatloaf they made, someone else could say, hey, you didn't follow this step that Kenji said, therefore it can't be the best meatloaf. Like, you did it wrong or something. And I really hate that. And so, part of the idea of the children's book was like to help kids understand the idea that best is contextual and also best is personal. So it's like, what might be best for me might not be best for you, and also what might be best for me right now might not be best for me tomorrow, and that's okay, right? You can use the word best and use it as a purely positive thing without having to use it to put other people down, or using it as a way to sort of close your mind to other things. So that was the sort of theme behind the book. But I think parents liked it. The response has been good.
Awesome. Well, we're going to come back and talk about the book in a minute, but let's kind of learn a little bit more about your family. You're here in Seattle now. You've got a wonderful wife. She's got a great career. 2 young children. You're really in that balancing act, and share us a little bit about your family and what's going on these days. And
Well,
you have time for this interview, barely.
My wife is in the computer industry. She's but she's a very private person, so I'm not going to talk too much about.
Okay, but you just came out from her.
We came out from, we were living in the Bay Area for 5 years, and then we moved to Seattle 2 years ago. We have a 5.5-year-old daughter, Alicia, and a 10-month-old son, who are both wonderful. But having a 5.5-year-old and a 10-month-old at the same time, it's like really in the thick of it now, especially at bedtime. Balancing work and life has been a challenge, but basically, when my daughter was born, I thought I could do everything. It's like I wanted to be a stay-at-home dad. So like I wanted to be my wife wanted to keep working, so I was like, I'll be the primary caretaker, which I was. But then I also thought, this is having one kid. This is pretty easy so far. Maybe like I'll open a restaurant, and so I did that, and then I realized pretty quickly, having a kid and a restaurant doesn't work very well.
And this was the one in
Wurst Hall, in San Mateo.
Yeah, San Mateo.
And so over the last few years, I've become very good at saying no to things, especially when I was younger, like in my 20s and 30s. If somebody came to me with an idea that sounded in any way fun, I would say yes, yeah, of course I'll do that. Of course I'll do it. Like I have all the energy in the world, I have all the time in the world. I'll do it. And that worked really well as far as like building a career and building relationships. But you can't do that with kids. And I learned that the hard way. It was difficult at first, but through practice and
Yeah.
and therapy and all these things that help you deal with these issues. I've gotten very good at saying no to people, and so now I think I have a very sort of healthy and structured balance where I get to spend a lot of time with my kids.
Yeah. So with that, it seems you do a lot of home cooking, and of course your photos and things that you post, I mean, they just look gorgeous, and I know they're all done at home and a lot for the family. Is that kind of where things are at now? It gives you a chance to share what you've learned and keep connected to your viewers and the same time serve your family? I mean, they get wonderful meals.
Over the last couple of years, I started doing YouTube content, and the formula I found that's worked for me there was that I don't script anything. I don't plan what I'm going to make. It's the basic rule is like, if I'm going to be cooking something for my family anyway, and my family is currently out of the house because we don't share any pictures of our children, or my wife doesn't like to be in the videos. So if I'm in the house by myself and I'm cooking something for my family, and my camera is nearby, then I will shoot the process and show how I'm doing it, and I'll narrate. Because when I was doing my first book tour, I got relatively well practiced at cooking and talk, because I did a lot of live demos, and so I got well practiced at cooking and explaining what I was doing at the same time and talking about the process and sort of injecting a bit of science here and there, and so that's essentially what I imagine myself doing when I'm making my cooking videos. I'm cooking, I explain what I'm doing, I find that it's actually a very good companion to the book, because the book it has this feeling, I think, that people read it and they think, oh, it's like dense and it's sort of prescriptive, and here's a recipe that has 40 ingredients and I have to follow it exactly. Ideally, what I want you to take from the book is the techniques and the science, and then apply them to your everyday cooking. And I think being able to do these videos where I just cook myself, I'm able to explain why I'm doing things, how I'm deviating from a recipe. I think one of the running jokes in my videos is that I never follow the recipe as I wrote it. So there might be a recipe in my book, but I'll only very loosely follow it, and I'll do it based on what's in my refrigerator or based on how much time I have. Sometimes, like, I might be cooking and my daughter will walk in the middle, and so I'll turn off the camera. When I have the time, I'll pick it up again and I'll say, hey, sorry, like my daughter came in, I stopped the process here, here's what I'm doing now. So I think the fact that it's like a real person cooking real food for their real family, and explaining how I make substitutions and stuff, I think that is what is mostly appealing to it, because there's a lot of very sort of slickly produced food videos and food content out there where where you feel like, I can't do this.
I can't do it. And that's why your videos are so accessible and so popular.
And it's been a good formula for me because it fits into my lifestyle.
Yeah.
And it shows a side of the cooking that I think is sort of underrepresented in visual media right now.
Right. Very good. You get a lot of good feedback. So a couple other interesting areas I just want to ask you. You've been in a lot of different cities. You've lived in a few of them for extended period of time, and now you're here in Seattle. We're from Seattle, so a lot of interest would be, so what do you think about the food scene here in Seattle, and how might that compare with other cities? And you do cover a lot of restaurants.
Yeah.
And I hear, and I go to some of the restaurants after I've read about them from you, but there's so much. But I hear that everybody gets a really nice little bump, or maybe a larger bump in business when you've written about Seattle, a local restaurant. But
the food scene, I mean, I love the food scene in Seattle. For me, I grew up in New York, but for me, New York is always, and I spent a long time living there and writing about the food in New York, doing reviews and stuff. But to me, New York has always been too big. It's like there's always so much stuff happening that you just feel like you always have this perpetual like racing to get the right thing, and feel like you're missing out on so much other stuff. It's like, how can I possibly decide what I'm going to have? Whereas Seattle has like a comfortable food scene. To me, it reminds me of Boston in that way, where it's like you can get great stuff, and you can get a variety of stuff, but it feels manageable still. And what I especially love about Seattle, well, first of all, the seafood. To me, in fact, in that sense, it reminds me of Boston as well, which both towns I think have the best sort of casual seafood scene, whereas in a city like New York or San Francisco, you can get great seafood, but it's usually at a fancier restaurant, or it's expensive. Right. Whereas in Boston, Seattle, it's like you can go to like a fish and chip shop, you can get chowder, you can get all these things that are just staple foods that are inexpensive, and they're all around and they're very fresh. And so, yeah, and and in general, a theme I found in the Seattle restaurants is that they're casual,
Very
and
casual.
and relaxed.
Right.
It's
right.
like,
That's Seattle.
and in some way, in many ways, that's great. Especially like I can go to like all but the nicest restaurants, like dressed as I am,
like
and
that.
nobody's going to kick me out.
Yeah.
Like if I go to Canlis, I have to wear a jacket maybe, but
yeah.
but anywhere else, I can get in
Yeah.
dressed however I want.
So when you go into these restaurants, and of course you don't get paid for it, you go anonymously, although I'm sure a lot of people are starting to recognize you, but you just show up, right? And you just,
just like a customer.
yeah, just like a customer.
I mean,
and how's that worked out? And then you write about your experience, and
if it's a good experience,
if it's a good experience,
it's been great. I've also made this sort of conscious decision whereas when I was working in New York and reviewing restaurants, and we had this like quota of reviews. Like every Tuesday we have a review, every Thursday we write about a sandwich, whatever it is. There you feel, and I felt a much stronger pressure to talk about both good and bad experiences, right? Whereas now it's like I do it for fun. So it's like if I have a bad experience, especially having been in the restaurant industry for so long and then seeing what happened to the restaurant industry during the pandemic, it's like if I had a bad experience, I don't need to tell people, right? And except in very few specific circumstances. But generally, like I share only my positive experiences. Partly it's a service thing. It's like if you write about a good place and you send, people read it and they're like, oh, I have to go there. And so a bunch of people who might not have had that on their radar now will. And so the business gets a good bump in service. People get to experience good food. Whereas if you write about a bad place, a bad experience, you're not really helping that many people because, like, first of all, it's like, all right, you're putting down a business that probably is struggling already, but you're also, you're not, most people were probably not going to go to that place anyway. So you're maybe deterring a couple of people who are thinking of going there from going there. So you're not really providing a service to your readers, and you're also doing something that's not so nice to, people who are probably working very hard. So I think focusing really on the positive aspects of the food industry and good restaurants has been great, both for my mental health and also I think as far as I think making people feel good.
So,
I think
so today, Kenji, and I want to talk a little bit more quickly about your latest book, so today, kind of the balance of what you're doing, still doing a lot of great cooking and videos and the photos and the social media. But able to still balance, is that kind of where you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean,
more?
my weekly schedule is for 3 days of the week I'll be with one of the kids all day. So
that's great.
And then 2 days of the week I work. So I do interviews, or I make a video, or I test recipes, work on, and then at night I often work as well. I mean, this book just came out in February, but I'm now starting work on a new book, and so I'll be doing that, mainly at night, which is when I do my writing after bedtime.
We're not to know yet about what the book is.
I can share. Yeah, I mean, it might with the caveat that it might change, but the idea right now is on yoshoku, so on Western Japanese cuisine. So Japanese home cooking, specifically Japanese foods that are inspired by Western dishes. So hamburger steak, tonkatsu, curry udon, as well as sort of doing a couple of sort of more Japanese American things. So Hawaiian Japanese food, so things like lokomoko and.
But you've got a lot of that too, also in the.
So there's some of it, but we'd be going much deeper into it, and also things like Northwest teriyaki, right? So like chicken teriyaki is not a thing in Japan, but it was invented in Seattle, right? And so Japanese influenced American, well-known American dishes as well.
That's great. So this book, is there anything that you want to share, and just for the audience, I'm unabashedly promoting it. I'm not a chef, and my daughter is here helping with the camera, and she knows, but I do cook. And this has just been so accessible, and it's just so great. But I do want to ask you a question about this, and so everybody can see the book here, and it's definitely worth everything. In fact, when I first read it, then I ran down to Uwajimaya and got the carbon steel walk. We've all had different walks over the years, but that's just a perfect walk. And Denise, as you know, the CEO, she goes, we have to order more of those walks. But a lot of the audience who is Asian
Or
or
Asian
Japanese
American,
American or others who are going to hear about this interview have been familiar with walks.
Mhm.
And I know I learned a lot more, but maybe you can share for all of us how you brought this to another level and why people should actually, look and
Yeah, I mean, so I mean,
what's the benefit?
well,
No, 'cause-
my first piece of advice would be that if you've been cooking with a wok your whole life, you should continue to cook the way you cook. If you've enjoyed cooking in it and you know the dishes you like to make, there's no reason to change those things. That said, if you're more well versed in, say, Japanese dishes, like my mom cooked a lot of Japanese dishes in the wok growing up, but my dad cooked Chinese dishes. Obviously the wok is Chinese originally, but it's been adopted by many other Asian cultures as well. But if you're familiar with one specific cuisine and you want to sort of expand your repertoire into other cuisines, that would be, I think, a good reason to pick it up. But also, if you've ever wondered, in the same way that you wonder with like Western food, like why do I sear my steak like this? It's like why do we toss food? Why do we use this specific kind of heat? Are there ways that I can control the heat to get results that are better or different from what I've been doing? That's really what I try and focus on in this book is really, there's obviously a lot of recipes, but I really try and drill down into sort of the technique and the science behind it and why you might want to cook things a certain way, why you might, for instance, want to wash meat, right? Which is a contentious topic, but like there are measurable texture benefits to washing your meat vigorously, or why you might want to treat your meat with baking soda, or techniques like velveting that maybe some people might not be super familiar with. You
bring it to another level because, really, in the way that you wrote this book, there's so much here, but you put in probably years of knowledge and research, and you put it all in a package for us, which that's significant for those of us who don't have the time.
Yeah.
We can just open up the middle of the book here and say, oh, wow, I learned something I didn't know. So I think it's just great.
Well, that was my goal, so thank you.
So I think we're running out of time here. Thank you so much, Kenji, for your time.
Yeah.
I know this has been great. I just want to, everybody can see the book here, but could you just talk about maybe how they can reach you or your website or whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, you can't reach me like physically, but
Right.
but I'm on Instagram and YouTube. So Kenji Lopez Alt on Instagram, and I have a YouTube channel. If you look up Kenji Lopez Alt on YouTube, I'll come up. I read comments, so if people have questions, they can ask in the comments. And I have a website, kenjilopezalt.com, where you can find links to purchasing any of my books. But you can also just go to your local bookstore and ask them, and hopefully they will have it. Or if you prefer, order it, from one of those evil online corporations, and they will definitely have it as well.
Okay, very good. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kenji.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure spending time with you.
Yeah, it was so nice.
All right. Thank you.